In the spring of 1881, a woman stood at the edge of 200 acres that everyone in the valley called worthless, and by the time she was done with it, that same land would feed more families than any farm for 50 miles around. Her name was Margaret Coyle, and she hadn't asked for any of this. The land came to her the way most hard things did back then, through loss. Her uncle, a man named Elias Bowen, had staked the claim some 15 years earlier, back when the valley was still mostly open range, and a man with a wagon and a strong back could carve out a life if he was stubborn enough. Elias was stubborn, all right. But he was also unlucky, and when he passed with no children of his own, the deed went to the only family he had left, Margaret. Now, you have to understand what this land actually was, because overrun doesn't quite capture it. This wasn't a neglected pasture with some tall grass and a few brambles. This was 200 acres of thorny locust saplings, packed so tight in places, you couldn't walk a straight line for more than 20 feet. Wild blackberry canes had knitted themselves into walls higher than a man's head. There were patches of sumac spreading like a rash across what used to be open meadow. And beneath all of it, choking the ground itself, was a tangle of vine and brambles so thick that sunlight barely touched the soil come July. Elias had let it go wild in his last few years, too sick to fight it back, and nature had done what nature does when nobody's watching. It had taken over completely. The neighbors had opinions, and they weren't shy about sharing them. There was a rancher named Thomas Hale who ran cattle on the parcel just east of Margaret's new land, and he told her kindly enough, in that way men had of being condescending while pretending to be helpful, that she ought to just let the county have it back for taxes. There's no clearing that, he said, not by a woman alone, not by 10 men with axes in under 5 years. You'd spend more clearing it than the land's worth once it's clear. And by every measure, anyone in that valley understood he was right. Clearing brush like that meant grubbing out root systems by hand, burning what you could burn without setting the whole hillside on fire, and fighting a losing battle against regrowth that would creep back in from the edges faster than you could push forward. Men had tried it on smaller plots and given up, moved on, let the land return to bramble within 2 seasons. 200 acres of it was by any sane calculation a life sentence of labor for no clear payoff. Margaret listened to all of it. She was 34 years old, widowed 3 years earlier when her husband had gone down with a fever that took half the men on their side of the river that winter. She had one son, 12 years old, named Daniel, and a modest cabin on a much smaller parcel that barely fed the 2 of them. She had no money for hired labor, no husband to share the work, and no illusions about her own physical limits. She could not clear 200 acres by hand. Nobody could, not in any reasonable span of time. Not without resources she simply didn't have. But Margaret had grown up on a hardscrabble farm in the hill country of Kentucky before her family moved west, and there was one thing she remembered clearly from those years, the way her father's small herd of goats could strip a hillside bare in a season. Not destroy it, strip it. There's a difference, and it's a difference most people didn't understand back then, and honestly, a lot of people still don't understand now. Goats don't eat like cattle. Cattle graze. They eat grass, low and even, working across open ground. Goats browse. They go up. They go after the woody stuff, the leaves, the bark, the thorny stems that everything else avoids. A goat will stand on its hind legs to strip a blackberry cane. A goat will eat sumac like it's a delicacy. A goat, given enough time, and enough of them, will do to 200 acres of choking brush what no team of men with axes could do in the same span, not by cutting it, but by simply eating the valley back into existence one mouthful at a time. So instead of buying tools, instead of trying to hire labor she couldn't afford, Margaret took what little savings she had left from her husband's estate and did something that made half the valley think she'd lost her sense entirely. She bought goats. 31 of them, to be exact. A mixed herd she picked up from a trader passing through who was glad to offload them cheap, because goats had a reputation in that valley too, mostly as a nuisance animal, escape artists that ate laundry off the line and never brought in the kind of money cattle did. Thomas Hale, when he heard about it, apparently laughed for a solid minute before he caught himself and asked if she was serious. She was serious. And on a cool morning in April, with her son Daniel helping her walk the fence line, what little fence line there was, mostly makeshift rail sections dragged into place along the property's edges, Margaret opened the gate on a borrowed wagon and let 31 goats loose onto 200 acres of the thickest, nastiest bramble in the valley. What happened next didn't look like progress. Not at first. It looked, if anything, like chaos. The goats scattered in every direction, delighted, and for the first few weeks Margaret couldn't even tell if they were doing anything useful or just wandering aimlessly through brush too thick for her to track them through. She'd walk the edges of the land in the evenings, listening for the bells she'd hung around a few of their necks, trying to get some sense of where the herd had gotten to that day. And mostly what she found was more of the same tangled green wall she'd started with. But goats are creatures of habit and appetite, and within that first month, patterns started to emerge. The goats gravitated first toward the tender growth, new shoots, young saplings, the softest and easiest brush to reach. That's where they did their damage first, and it was damage you could see. Little clearings started opening up, not in any planned way, just wherever the herd had spent the most time working. A patch here where they'd stripped every locust sapling under 4 feet down to bare stem. A widening gap there where blackberry canes had been chewed back to nubs. Margaret kept a journal that whole first year, not out of any sense that she was doing something historic, just out of the same practical habit that made her check on the goats every evening. That journal survived, passed down through her family, and it's honestly one of the best records we have of exactly how this kind of land reclamation actually unfolds month by month, because most of the men who tried similar things never bothered writing any of it down. They either succeeded quietly or failed quietly, and either way, nobody thought to record the details. In May of that first year, she wrote about losing 3 goats to a mountain lion that had come down from the ridge, and about how she'd had to start bringing the herd in, closer to the cabin at night, into a rough pen Daniel helped her build using deadfall timber they dragged out from the property's edge. That was a real cost, a real setback. 3 goats out of 31 is almost 10% of her herd gone in a single incident, and she had no money to replace them. She wrote about staying up 2 nights in a row with an old shotgun across her knees, watching the tree line, terrified the cat would come back for more. It didn't come back that season, but the fear of it shaped everything that followed. She fenced more aggressively than she'd planned to, using what materials she could scavenge and trade for. And that fencing effort turned out to matter more than she could have known at the time, because it meant she could control, at least loosely, where the herd concentrated its browsing. Instead of 31 goats wandering 200 acres at random, she started using temporary rail sections to push them into smaller sections of the land, forcing them to work an area thoroughly before she moved them on to the next. It wasn't a formal system. She hadn't read about rotational grazing in some agricultural journal because, frankly, the kind of formal understanding of rotational browsing that ranchers use today didn't really exist in any widespread documented way back then. She was improvising, working off instinct, and her father's old habits, and a healthy dose of trial and error. By the end of that first summer, she had roughly 15 acres that looked meaningfully different from where she'd started. Not cleared, not by a long shot, but thinned. The thickest bramble had been knocked back. Saplings that would have grown into another decade of impenetrable thicket had been stripped bare and were struggling, some of them dying outright, from having every leaf repeatedly eaten before they could photosynthesize enough to recover. 15 acres out of 200 doesn't sound like much. Thomas Hale, riding past on his way to check his own cattle, apparently made a comment to that effect, something about how, at this rate, she'd be an old woman before the job was done, if it ever got done at all. But Margaret understood something that Hale didn't, something that anyone who's ever managed livestock on marginal land eventually learns, which is that herds grow. 31 goats, properly managed, don't stay 31 goats. Goats breed fast. A healthy nanny goat can have twins nearly every year, sometimes triplets, and by the start of that second season, Margaret's herd had grown to just over 40 animals. More mouths meant more browsing capacity, which meant she could work larger sections of land in the same amount of time. The math of it compounds in a way that's almost invisible at first, and then suddenly isn't. That second year, 1882, is when the real transformation started to show. She'd learned from the mountain lion scare and invested what little money she had into better fencing and a proper night pen, and that security meant fewer losses, which meant the herd kept growing. She'd also learned, through pure trial and error, which sections of land the goats cleared fastest, and why. The sandy, well-drained soil on the eastern side of the property, closer to where Hale's cattle range butted up against her land, cleared almost twice as fast as the low, wetter ground near the creek that cut through the property's western edge. The brush there was different, more willow, more moisture-loving growth, that the goats seemed less eager to tackle, and she had to adjust her rotation to spend extra time in those sections, sometimes doubling back on land she thought she'd already cleared because regrowth had crept back in. This is the part of the story that doesn't get told enough when people talk about goats clearing land, and it's worth sitting with for a second, because it's the difference between a story that sounds like magic and a process that's actually just hard, intelligent work. Goats don't clear land once and leave it cleared. Brush wants to come back. Root systems that have been established for years, sometimes decades, don't just give up because the leaves got eaten a few times. Locust and sumac especially will send up new shoots from the same root crown again and again. And if you let the goats move on too fast and don't return to hit those regrowth shoots while they're still tender, you end up right back where you started within a couple of seasons. Margaret figured this out the hard way in the second year when she pushed the herd westward too aggressively, eager to make progress on the tougher wetland brush, and came back in late summer to find that a 5-acre section she'd considered mostly cleared back in the spring had put up nearly 2 feet of new sumac growth in her absence. It was a gut punch of a discovery, the kind of thing that would make anyone question whether the whole plan was actually working or whether she'd just been fooling herself. She wrote in her journal that night, and this passage survived. It's one of the more quoted lines from the whole collection when her descendants eventually shared parts of it, that the land does not stay one. It must be won again and again until the goats have taught it, the way a stubborn child is taught that it is easier to stay small than to fight back. That reframing changed how she worked. She stopped thinking of the clearing process as a single sweep from one end of the property to the other and started thinking of it as a cycle. Clear a section, move on, come back before the regrowth got established, hit it again and again, each time with slightly less growth to fight because each browsing cycle weakened the root systems a little further. It's the same principle, essentially, that modern rotational grazing and brush management rely on today, though nobody in that valley in 1882 would have called it that. She just called it working the goats right. Sand. By the end of the second season, she had somewhere around 50 acres in a state she considered genuinely cleared, not just thinned, but browsed down to where grass and low forage were starting to reclaim the ground the brush had been choking out for years. And this is where something interesting started happening that she hadn't fully anticipated when she started this whole project, the goat manure. 2 winters and 2 summers of 40-plus goats, concentrated on that 50 acres, had deposited an enormous amount of manure across that ground, and goat manure, unlike a lot of other livestock waste, is famously good fertilizer. It doesn't need to be composted as long or as carefully as cow manure. To avoid burning plants, it's drier, more pelletized, breaks down steadily, and it's rich in the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that exhausted or neglected soil desperately needs. Elias's neglected land hadn't just been overgrown, it had been depleted too. The topsoil thinned and starved from years of nobody managing it, nobody rotating any kind of productive use across it. What Margaret was discovering, almost as a side effect of the clearing process, rather than the primary goal, was that her goats weren't just removing the problem. They were actively repairing the ground underneath it. Every acre they cleared, they also fertilized, trampled, aerated with their hooves, and left considerably richer than they found it. Thomas Hale, to his credit, was the kind of man who could admit when he was wrong, even slowly. By the middle of the third year, 1883, when Margaret had somewhere close to 100 acres in various stages of clearing, and her herd had grown past 70 animals through breeding and a few careful cheap purchases from other goat owners looking to offload their own troublesome stock, he rode over one afternoon and asked, apparently without much preamble, What her plan was for all the cleared ground once the goats finished with it. And this is the part of the story where Margaret's actual vision comes into focus, because clearing the land was never the end goal. It was the first phase of something much bigger that she'd been quietly planning the whole time, sketching out in the back pages of that same journal while the goats did their work. She'd noticed, during those first 2 years of watching her herd move across the property, that different sections of the 200 acres had genuinely different characters once you stripped away the choking brush that had been hiding them. The eastern section, the sandy, well-drained ground that cleared fastest, turned out to have a gentle, south-facing slope that caught sun beautifully for most of the day. The kind of ground that, once cleared and fertilized by 2 years of goat manure, would be excellent for row crops or an orchard. The low ground near the creek on the western edge, the slow, stubborn wetland brush that had given her so much trouble in year 2, turned out to be genuinely fertile bottomland once cleared, the kind of ground that would flood gently in spring and leave behind silt, perfect for hay or pasture grass once it wasn't being smothered by willow scrub. And the rocky middle section, the part nobody had expected much from at all, turned out to have decent grazing potential once cleared, not good enough for crops, but more than good enough to support livestock. In other words, what Margaret had inherited as a single, undifferentiated mass of worthless, overgrown land was actually, underneath all that brush, 3 or 4 distinct types of agricultural ground, each suited to something different. And she'd only been able to see that because the goats had spent 2 years slowly peeling back the brush and revealing what was actually there. So her plan, laid out to Thomas Hale on that afternoon in 1883, in what must have been an extremely satisfying conversation for her, was this. The eastern slope would become an orchard, apple and pear trees mostly, since that ground and that sun exposure was about as good as anything in the valley for fruit. The western bottomland would become hay ground and eventually pasture for a small dairy operation, since the fertility and the moisture there made it ideal for exactly that. And the rocky middle section, the one everyone had assumed was the most worthless part of an already worthless property, would stay in goats permanently, because she'd realized by then that the goats themselves, not just their labor, but the animals as an asset in their own right, were worth continuing to raise. Goat milk, goat cheese, goat meat, and goat hides. All had markets, even if those markets were smaller and less prestigious than cattle markets. And she had by that point a herd that had grown to over 70 animals from an initial investment of 31, essentially for free, just through natural breeding. Hale reportedly didn't say much in response to all this, which for a man who'd laughed at her plan 2 years earlier was apparently its own kind of concession. The fourth year, 1884, is really where everything converged. By that spring, virtually the entire 200 acres had been through at least one full cycle of goat browsing. And the sections cleared earliest, that original 50 acres from years 1 and 2, had now had an additional year or two of rest and recovery. With grass and soil rebuilding steadily under the continued light grazing Margaret kept up to prevent brush regrowth. She used what savings she'd managed to accumulate, plus a small loan she secured from a bank in the nearest town, a loan she was able to get, notably because she could point to real, visible, physical proof that the land was being transformed. Rather than just asking a banker to take her word for a plan on paper to purchase her first fruit tree saplings for the eastern slope, somewhere around 200 apple and pear trees, planted in careful rows across ground that 18 months earlier had been an impenetrable wall of locust and thorn. She also began construction that year on a proper dairy operation for the western bottomland. Nothing fancy, a modest barn and a milking parlor, built mostly with her own labor, her sons, now 16 and strong enough to be genuinely useful. And some hired help she could finally afford thanks to the loan and thanks to the fact that word had started spreading through the valley about what she'd actually managed to do out there. A few of her goats, the ones with the best milk production, became the foundation of that dairy operation, supplemented over the following couple of years with proper dairy goats purchased once she had income to reinvest at her. By the end of that fourth year, the transformation was, by any measure, complete enough to silence every single person who'd told her this land was worthless. 200 acres that Thomas Hale and every other neighbor in the valley had considered a lost cause, a tax burden, a piece of ground not worth the effort of clearing, had become a working, diversified, increasingly productive farm, an orchard taking root on the eastern slope, a dairy operation established on the fertile western bottomland, and a permanent self-sustaining goat herd, now well over 100 animals, working the rocky middle ground and continuing to generate manure that got hauled out to fertilize the orchard and the hay fields, closing a loop that fed every part of the operation back into every other part. And here's the detail that really drives home just how completely the valley's perception flipped over those 4 years. In 1885, the year after that fourth season wrapped up, the county assessor came through to reassess property values across the region, as they did periodically back then. Margaret's land, which had been valued at essentially nothing when she inherited it, some records suggest it was assessed at barely a few dollars an acre, reflecting its status as unusable brushland, was reassessed at a value that, adjusted for the improvements, made it one of the most valuable agricultural parcels in that stretch of the valley. Higher, acre for acre, than Thomas Hale's cattle range. Higher than most of the established farms that had been under cultivation for a decade or more. The apple and pear trees took a few more years to reach full production, as fruit trees do. But by 1888, roughly 7 years after she first opened that gate and let 31 goats loose onto the brush, Margaret Coyle's farm was reportedly shipping fruit to markets 2 counties over, running one of the more respected small dairy operations in the region, and maintaining a goat herd that other landowners had started specifically asking to borrow or lease for exactly the same purpose she'd originally used them for. Clearing their own, overgrown, marginal land, because word had spread and people had seen the results with their own eyes. And suddenly, the animal everyone had dismissed as a nuisance was in genuine demand as a tool. There's something in this story that goes beyond just an interesting piece of frontier agricultural history. And it's worth sitting with for a moment because it's the kind of pattern that shows up again and again in all sorts of contexts whenever someone looks at a problem that everyone else has already written off. The valley's collective judgment about that land wasn't stupid. It wasn't laziness or lack of imagination in any simple sense. Clearing brush by hand really was as brutal and unrewarding as everyone said. The math really didn't work if you were counting on axes and hired labor and a fixed timeline. Thomas Hale wasn't wrong about the tools he was imagining. He was wrong about the tools that actually existed because he was thinking about the problem the same way everyone else in that valley thought about it, using the same methods everyone else used, and none of those methods happened to be suited to what that land actually needed. Margaret's advantage wasn't that she was smarter than her neighbors or worked harder than they would have, though she certainly worked hard. Her advantage was that she'd grown up somewhere else, seen a different set of tools used for a different purpose, and was willing to apply an old, low-status, somewhat looked-down-upon method to a problem that everyone else was trying to solve, with methods that simply didn't fit the scale of the land or the resources available to a widow with no capital, no hired labor. She looked at 31 animals that most of her neighbors considered a nuisance breed, barely worth the trouble of fencing, and saw them as exactly the right tool for the specific unglamorous grinding problem she actually had. And there's a second layer to it too, which is patience. Not passive patience, not just waiting around, but the specific kind of patience that comes from trusting a slow compounding process, even when the early results look unimpressive. 15 acres cleared in the first year, out of 200 really did look like almost nothing. If you'd shown Margaret's neighbors that 15-acre patch and told them it would eventually become part of one of the most valuable farms in the valley, most of them would have laughed. The same way Hale did. The process looked, for at least the first year, and probably well into the second, exactly like the kind of thing a reasonable person should give up on. It's only in hindsight, once the compounding really kicks in, the herd growing, the cleared acreage expanding faster each year as more goats work more ground, the soil quietly rebuilding underneath all of it, that the slow start looks less like failure and more like the necessary first stage of something that simply couldn't have moved any faster. That's a hard thing to trust in the moment. It's easy to trust in hindsight, telling the story now, knowing how it ends. It's a completely different thing to be standing in year one, looking at 15 cleared acres out of 200, 3 goats dead from a mountain lion, a bank account with nothing left in it, and a valley full of neighbors who think you've made a fool's decision. And to keep going anyway, because you believe the process will keep compounding if you just don't quit on it. Margaret Coyle didn't quit on it. She kept adjusting, kept learning, the fencing after the mountain lion, the rotational cycling after the regrowth scare, the recognition that different sections of land wanted different long-term uses once the brush came off them. None of it happened according to some perfect master plan she had from day one. It happened through observation, through trial and error, through paying close attention to what the land and the animals were actually telling her rather than forcing them into a plan she'd decided on in advance. That's arguably the most important part of the whole story, more important even than the goats themselves. The goats were the tool, the attentiveness was the actual skill. By the time Daniel, her son, was a grown man, the farm had expanded its reputation well beyond that single valley. Margaret lived long enough to see her original insight, that unwanted animals could be the answer to unwanted land, become something other landowners in the region actively sought out and paid for, hiring or borrowing goat herds, specifically to reclaim their own overgrown parcels, a practice that in various forms has never really gone away since. If you know anything about modern land management, you probably already know that goats are still used exactly this way today, on a much larger and more scientifically managed scale, for exactly the same reasons Margaret stumbled onto more than a century ago. Vineyards use them to clear undergrowth between growing seasons. Utility companies use them to manage brush under power lines without spraying herbicides. Fire departments in dry regions use them to reduce fuel loads on hillsides prone to wildfire. The specific practice Margaret pioneered out of necessity, with no formal knowledge and no model to follow, turned out to be so effective that it's still standard practice today, just with better fencing and more research behind it. What she left behind, when she eventually passed the farm on to Daniel, and it continued in the family for at least another generation after that, wasn't just a productive piece of ground. It was proof of a specific way of thinking about a problem. The idea that the most useless-looking asset available to you might actually be the exact right tool for the most useless-looking problem in front of you, if you're willing to look past what everyone else assumes about both of them. 200 acres that an entire valley agreed were worthless. 31 goats that an entire valley considered a nuisance. 4 years of unglamorous repetitive work, moving fences, tracking a herd through brush, losing animals to predators, discovering regrowth you thought you'd beaten, adjusting, starting sections over, watching manure pile up and turning that into a plan rather than a mess to deal with. None of it looked impressive while it was happening, all of it taken together. Built one of the most productive holdings in the valley, out of exactly the two things everyone else had already decided to throw away. That's really the whole story, and maybe the whole lesson too, if there is one. The most valuable thing on that 200 acres was never hidden somewhere else, waiting to be found. It was right there the entire time, buried under brush that everyone assumed made the land worthless, waiting for someone to bring in the one tool capable of clearing it away, an animal that everyone else in the valley had already decided wasn't worth the trouble of keeping.